alaikum. Welcome to another episode of Agahi with your host, Warisa. In most of our programs, we always talk about mental health, psychological well-being, spirituality, and all the issues that affect your well-being generally. But in today's episode, we're going to address a topic that is quite sensitive and rarely talked about. And I'm extremely grateful to my guest for today, Tara Alston, who will be joining us. And I will let Tara introduce herself and talk about the brilliant work that she does around human trafficking and how it's considered as modern slavery in today's time. Tara, welcome to Agahi. Thank you so much for joining us.
And thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. I am Tara Alston, and I am the author of upcoming book, Yet Still I Stand. And that is a book that's soon to be released. And it's about some of the challenges, hardships, abuse that I had experienced and triumphing over that trauma. I'm also the founder and owner of Yet Still I Stand. And that is a business where I do go and speak on my personal experiences of my journey and trials, but also focus on the aspect of healing from those experiences. And then I speak on issues such as child abuse, domestic abuse, trauma, and human trafficking, which is what we'll be discussing today.
And these topics are extremely, extremely sensitive, and I know it may trigger certain responses. So if anytime you feel uncomfortable or you feel you need to speak to someone, please feel free to call in our studio number, and we'll be more than happy to connect you with the right person or organization. So Tara, you mentioned that you've written a book on the subject. Please tell us about that.
So the book that I have written really discusses my life, and I did experience things from the time I was a child until throughout some of my adulthood, and I detail in high level some of those experiences, and then the different things that I went through in an effort to ensure that I was healing from those traumatic experiences and growing, and then putting those experiences into good use today.
And that is a really powerful thing in itself, because most people, when they experience something like this, they may spend their entire lives trying to understand why it happened and how I can cope with it, let alone to write about it and speak about that experience. And I really, really do admire you for doing that, Tara. And I really hope that today's show is going to be extremely beneficial for anyone who may be able to relate. So, talking about human trafficking, tell our viewers what it's all about and how we, as people who may have not experienced it or have first-hand experience of this whole thing, how can we identify that someone may be a victim?
So human trafficking, as you said, is often referred to as modern day slavery. And it's a crime in which people profit from the exploitation of others. So it is a criminal industry that it's a multi-billion-dollar criminal industry worldwide. So the statistics show that the profits are approximately $150 billion a year. And that is staggering. And then thinking about how many victims there are, it's reported that there's estimated 24.8 million people globally that are victims of human trafficking. But human trafficking is often underreported. So it is way beyond what we really know, but we go with the statistics and the information that we can gather. The United Nations had recently done a publication. It's called the 2020 Global Report on Trafficking in Persons. And it gave a lot of information about trafficking and what it looks like across the world. Right. There were 148 countries that responded to this report when they were doing the research on it. So it gave a good indication of worldwide what this looks like. And there are different forms of trafficking. So The two most common forms that are discussed are sexual exploitation and then forced labor. But there are multiple other ways to be trafficked. So the sexual exploitation, as far as that research had gone, and the reports that were made from those 148 countries made up 50% of the reports. Whereas forced labor was 38%, but that often goes pretty unreported. So we know that that is probably much larger of an issue than what we have the details for. But things such as criminal activity, whether that's pickpocketing or making sure that drugs are being cultivated and trafficked, or if it's forced begging, or forced marriages, forced children soldiers. There's trafficking such as baby selling, where either a pregnant woman is trafficked and or an infant is trafficked so that they can be illegally adopted out. And then removal of organs, like human organs, are also another form of trafficking. So there's a lot of different forms that were reported in this report that have been reported by the 148 countries that were involved. So it's happening everywhere, and it happens in cities and it happens in the countries. So it's not defined by the population and where it's occurring.
The statistics that you shared are truly shocking, and I'm sure there are a lot of underreported cases that don't even make up the news or media. And like you gave examples of different forms of trafficking. For example, human trafficking is kind of for people who are forced into labor, and we see these in so many countries where they have been affected by war or conflict, and they're trying to escape that situation, only to end up in another situation which is even more shocking and unbearable. So what kind of work is on the way to support such people who are vulnerable to these kind of perpetrators?
As far as the victims that are going through these experiences, you are correct. The places that are going through wars are where a lot of traffickers will target victims. And there are so many people getting involved in the anti-trafficking efforts at this point, and the awareness is being spread and people are getting more information. And when you have information, the saying goes, information is power. By the spread of this information and people becoming knowledgeable, they begin knowing what to look for in an effort to possibly help prevent trafficking. So they talk about prevention and then protection of victims, so they can be identified, and then they can go through recovery and healing and getting them the support that they need. And then also, depending on how people are placed in the community, they may also play a part in the prosecution that needs to happen for the traffickers and or buyers. So there are many ways that people are getting involved to help the victims. And there are places like homes, transitional homes for them set up to go to, and basic needs being met that you would need as you're leaving a situation such as that. And so there are many people involved in so many different avenues. It's really great that people are taking a stand against trafficking.
And I think according to the United Nations report, 20% of all the victims that are trafficked are children. In fact, in some parts of the world, for example, West Africa, it goes up to 100%. Yes. Why is that the case?
Children are often vulnerable. So we're finding that as far as children being trafficked, a lot of times they're trafficked by family members. So it's typically somebody that they know. If they're a child and they're being trafficked, it could be a family member or a family friend. It could be a friend, like somebody who has befriended them and pretends.
Trust.
Yes, it's going to most likely be somebody that you trust. That is one of the methods that traffickers use in order to get their victims in that situation is what we call a grooming process, where they will really take the time to learn their victims or their potential victims, to understand what needs they have that aren't being met, where they may be insecure. They will spend the time to do that because they look at it as an investment. And so then they'll take the time, once they figure out the needs, they'll take the time to temporarily meet those needs, oftentimes in order to gain that trust, have the victim build a bond with them, and then they'll exploit them.
So we know that the number of convictions for human trafficking is increasing on a daily basis. And I think 2 out of every 5 countries covered by the UN ODC report had not recorded a single conviction. And I kind of fail to understand why that is the case.
I believe it's twofold. So there are many countries who are spreading more awareness and getting more knowledgeable about human trafficking. So then they can take the time to set up the laws in order to prosecute and convict those involved, and others who may not have all of that information and the law set up yet. So they can't really do the prosecution and the conviction without having the laws in place. And I know even in the United States, there's federal laws that pertain to human trafficking, but then each state has their own laws as well. And some states are more advanced with the laws that are in place for that prosecution than others. So I'm sure it's similar with the countries, the different countries.
Yeah. So what can we do as the general public to reduce the vulnerability of victims and increase the risks to traffickers and lower the demand for the goods and services of what I call modern day slavery? Because surely as citizens of a country, there has to be something that can be done.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, we can all play some sort of a part. So the most important thing is like what we're doing today, educating ourselves and educating others, because without the information, it's hard to pursue any type of activity in the anti-trafficking efforts. But also being aware of your surroundings is really important, because if you know what to look for because you have that knowledge, and you start paying attention to the different things that you see, then you can potentially report and possibly save a life. And so making sure that you're aware of your surroundings, and then being a conscientious and informed consumer is also important.
Yeah.
Knowing where your products are coming from. And that way you can ensure that the supply chain is not utilizing forced labor, for instance. And then you can become a volunteer and support the NGOs that are there in place to help victims. You could become a mentor, because like we were just talking about, when it comes to children who are trafficked, a lot of times they don't have a good support system, and that goes for adults too. So if you serve as a mentor and reduce some of that vulnerability, that is also a great way to take part in these efforts. And then also when it comes to the laws in the countries that may need to prepare some more laws in order to prosecute, reaching out to those who are in power in an effort to try to get some of those laws in place, I think is important.
And it seems like it is an organized crime, because these groups or cults or whatever you may call them, they kind of operate in certain parts of the world, in certain parts of, you can say, cities or towns, where they know they can target a certain kind of population, whether it's women or children, because they are often perceived as the most vulnerable members of the society.
Right.
And I would like to share an example with you. This is a few years ago. There was an earthquake in Pakistan. And I remember that while people were still kind of trying to figure out how severe the impact is, there was already a group on ground trying to traffic young girls under the age of 16 from where the earthquake took place, and they had separated from their family members or teachers,
Yes.
and they had transported them. By the time the rescue services reached, they were gone, and their names were amongst the missing people's list, and it was assumed that they have passed away, and that was not the case. They were actually trafficked from that part of the country where people were affected. Yeah, I'm just speechless. I don't know what to say.
I know. Unfortunately, it does seem to be very organized, and they go after the most vulnerable. And so it is those situations to where I think that more and more places are becoming aware that this is occurring. So they're trying to get in there as quickly as possible and also be extra cautious and watching. And even before something happens, getting information out there about this is how this works. So what do we need to do to plan to prevent this? Because anytime that they can have people in a dire situation and they're separated from loved ones, and especially the children, that is an easy target for these traffickers. And unfortunately, it seems like the most vulnerable are the ones that they go after anyway. They're already experiencing some sort of hardship, even if it's not something like an earthquake or a war. They're already experiencing hardship. They may not have their basic needs being met. They could be homeless. They could have already experienced some sort of abuse. So maybe they're leaving one abusive situation and they end up in the hands of a trafficker, who then takes the time to groom them and tries to make them feel secure and cared for, in an effort to then just exploit them. So there's so many different things that they look for, but all of them are a vulnerability. And it's just heartbreaking to think about the fact that there are people who like to take advantage of people who are already hurting.
Are there any other ways where we can play our part in not encouraging, for example, in many parts of the world where unemployment is on the rise, you see that often children are on the streets, either begging or forced into child labor or forced into early marriages. And for them, the only way to escape that situation, like you said, they may be in an abusive situation, only to end up with somebody who will exploit them even further. What can we do to help? Say, for example, if we know there is a child out there, or a young person or a female who's out there on the streets and is vulnerable, because not every part of the world may be equipped in the sense that there are organizations that are there to support such people.
Yes.
But not in every country, not in every city or town.
Right. And that is where I think it's important for the people who do care to try to create bridges to those gaps. Because without basic necessities being provided, people are going to be looking for avenues in which to get their needs met. We have to eat. Having shelter is important. So making sure that if there is a place or an area that does not have those types of resources, the more that we can work to provide at least basic needs for people who are in need is really the only way to try to help prevent some of these vulnerabilities. So as a society, taking care of others in our society, and actually not just caring, but taking steps to care for them is very important.
Yeah, agree. Tara, you mentioned earlier on that you have also survived certain situations and circumstances, and now you are on your healing journey and you're helping other people to cope with certain situations. If you could share some of that with our viewers, because I'm sure there'll be plenty of people watching this program may be able to relate.
Yes, I experienced child abuse of all different forms throughout my childhood, and also had experienced some exploitation. It was not in the forms of trafficking, but other form of exploitation. And that really impacted how I thought about myself and my future and my value. And so I was one of the people that would have been very vulnerable to trafficking or to being trafficked. And so in my experiences, I noticed that what you experience as a child oftentimes creeps into your adulthood. So I went from abuse to abuse in my own scenario, to where even once I left the abusive situation as a child, I walked right into the hands of another abuser. And I was then married to an abuser and went through that for several years. And so it took a long time for me to be completely removed from an abusive situation and then be able to begin my healing process, because I think it would be very difficult to heal in the midst of that situation. So I went through my experiences, and then as I was healing and growing, it just seemed like there were so many people that you come into contact with that go through different experiences or different traumas that are so difficult for them, but somehow you can relate and encourage one another. And it really became a passion of mine to be able to help those who are in need or who have been abused, and be an encouragement that there is hope for healing, and that there's hope for a better life as you go through that process.
You mentioned that you started to heal, but not in the environment that you were in that caused the abuse, but once you left that environment, because you can't heal in the same environment that made you sick in the first place.
Correct.
Those who may have escaped or they're planning to escape, what advice would you give them to help them heal from everything that they have experienced? And what's the possibility of healing?
The possibility is 100%. I do believe that, we're all impacted in different ways, even after we've healed. So it's not that the things that you've experienced disappear. It's that you've been able to experience these things and then grow from them. And I believe that it can then lead to something beautiful that you're able to do. And the best experience or the best advice I would give upon leaving is to take the time and not rush into anything else. That's number one. Not rush yourself to do anything other than taking that time to reflect and to heal. And I know that faith was a big factor for me, and it is for so many people. And I think that we have to really look at healing in a holistic fashion. I don't think we're not one-dimensional people, right? So we have multiple dimensions to our lives. And so we need to take the time to heal both physically. That's going to be number one, just because if you are experiencing so many things physically, you've got to get those taken care of. But mentally and emotionally, it's important to take that time to heal as well. There are different avenues that you can take with that. There's counselors and social workers and people who are in place to professionally help, but you can also make sure that you have a tribe of supporters, whether that's one friend or whether it's a group that you could be part of that supports one another through the healing process. And then also making sure that you're taking the time spiritually to do what will help you heal in that manner as well.
Relating to what you discussed earlier, people often become targets for these cults, and we call them, who are involved in trafficking people. What are the strategies that can be taken by people who know that they can be victimized, who know that they are prone to such organizations or gangs, or they're
Right.
living in an environment where it's quite normal to end up like this?
I would say that being careful of who you let in your inner circle, so who you let be close to you, and the things that you get involved in initially are very important, because once a trafficker has you do something that you don't want to do, then it's even more difficult to get away from that situation, because they will also try to threaten to tell people or show people what you've done, which can cause people to stay in that vicious cycle as well. Or they will start threatening that they'll harm somebody else that you care about, which can keep people in that vicious cycle. So really being careful of who you let in your inner circle, what you get involved in, even initially, being weary of those who take a quick and sudden interest in you and what you're going through, what would be that grooming process, and trying to, like, they oftentimes overdo it with showering you with what looks like or feels like love, and gifts and things of that sort. So if somebody starts doing something like that, it should be a red flag,
Yes.
that maybe they don't have your best interest at heart, but really they're just trying to almost play a game, to get you to do what they want.
So what kind of red flags should one look out for? Say, for example, if it's a parent who has young children and they may be vulnerable, or even a young woman who doesn't feel secure and safe in the environment that she's living in. What are the red flags that they should look out for? Because the grooming process can be quite manipulative, in the sense that the one who is being manipulated or controlled or groomed, they may not be able to identify whether this person has genuine, legit interest, or is this somebody who's just an imposter?
Correct. As a parent with a child, I think that it's really important that we know who our children are communicating with, and spending time with, and the activities that they're involved in. So online, for instance, that is a big method of contact as far as traffickers and children. So if children have access, without any type of parental control or review, to online, whether it's social media, or maybe it's games, things of that sort, traffickers will actually look for children who are involved in games, for instance, and speak to them and act like possibly another child, to get them to, trust them and think that they're friends and things like that. And then they will convince them at some point to possibly meet up somewhere and do something fun. And then the child is in this situation. So it's really important that as parents, we know who is communicating with our children and trying to hang out with our children and spend time with them. Especially because, like I said, traffickers can be like family friends, for instance. So I know, for myself, I've always been very careful about who spends a lot of time with my kids. And so just making sure that you're watching that. As far as if I'm a young woman and I am in a situation to where I'm starting to feel unsafe, I think it's important that we talk to somebody about that, because we may not be thinking clearly. Everybody wants to feel loved and accepted and supported. So if we're going through the vulnerability of being insecure or feeling like we don't have support or nobody cares, and then somebody comes into our life and shows us the things that we want, oftentimes we want to believe that. So it's important that we have somebody that we can trust, whether it's a close friend or a professional, to where you can discuss these things, and make sure that you're seeing things clearly.
I'm really glad you mentioned that people who may be depressed or may be going through any mental health difficulty, they can be more prone to such people, like the ones who have a wrong intention to exploit you and take advantage of your vulnerability. And because this program is like based on mental health and well-being, people who may be, say for example, suffering from some kind of a psychological disorder, or they are going through a really challenging, difficult period in their life, they're more susceptible to looking out for someone who may be able to help them or just listen to their problems. And it's sometimes really difficult to distinguish who is there with good intentions, trying to listen to what you have to say,
Yes.
with the intention of exploiting you later on, or somebody who is a genuine person and is listening to your problems or the difficulties that you're going through with the intention of providing help, support, and guidance.
Correct.
How can you distinguish that, especially when you're going through a challenging phase in your life?
You may not be able to in the beginning. And I think that being cautious, anytime there is a newer relationship, whether that's a professional relationship or a friendship or whatever the situation may be, anytime there is a newer situation, I think that it's very important that we cautiously observe as we're going through it. Don't immediately give trust to people because they seem very nice and they seem to have your best intentions at heart in the beginning, but watching that play out, I think, is important. People earn your trust. And at the first sign of them wanting something from you because of them being there for you should be a huge red flag. And it doesn't matter how small or big what they want is. It's just making sure that you are observing and really focusing on those types of things as possible red flags so that you can protect yourself.
Yeah, that's really good.
Because this doesn't just come into play even with human trafficking. This could be somebody who is maybe narcissistic and is looking for their next victim in a relationship, and the type of abuse that you can experience in a relationship. So this would be an important thing across the board, not just for trafficking.
And some of the warning signs and red flags that you mentioned, I was thinking, this is quite similar between an intimate relationship with a narcissist and somebody who's grooming you or love bombing you so that they can exploit you later. So it seems like they have the same kind of mindset, and they use the same strategies to target their victim and exploit them later on.
Absolutely. And honestly, if you think about the mentality of a trafficker, they would almost have to have similar mentalities in order to be able to hurt the people that they're hurting. Because I can't imagine having that desire to exploit somebody. So I think that it does take somebody like that in order to be able to do these crimes and commit these abuses.
You mentioned about drug use and drug addiction, substance misuse, and how often people are trafficked just so that they can traffic the drug itself from one country or one city or one town to another. And in that process, often victims may not always be aware of what they're carrying. Like, we have this rule that if somebody gives you something to carry with you while you're traveling, you have to kind of mention that to the customs or declare that. And often people, out of ignorance, or they just trust somebody that they shouldn't be trusting that much,
right,
they end up taking that piece of parcel or what have you. How common is that?
It is likely very common, just because drug trafficking is really the only thing that drugs are the highest trafficked item. And so that goes hand in hand with so many trafficking victims as far as the exploitation is concerned, because they'll utilize these people to do what they want them to do, which is traffic these drugs, so that if they get caught, it's not the trafficker who's gotten caught and gets the charges. It is the victim who gets caught with the drugs and then gets the charges. And a lot of times the traffickers will use drugs in an effort to either get or maintain their victims as well. So they may drug them, like provide them with drugs, and then the victims are then addicted and have to continue doing what they're doing in an effort to meet that addiction. So drugs are a big part in trafficking, whether they're actually taking the drugs to someplace else and transporting the drugs themselves, or whether the victims themselves are being drugged.
You mentioned earlier on that traffickers use of the internet as digital hunting fields for vulnerable young people, and even elderlies who may not be well equipped with technology or the use of technology, and may fall for a scam, for example, or something which is sold to them online, only to find out that they have been scammed. Or with children, you can to an extent monitor them. But what about elderlies or people who are suffering from some kind of a disability, who may not have a good support system, or who may not be able to reach out to someone because they are not in a position to identify that something's going on online?
Right. I would recommend that anytime somebody is asking you for personal information, whether that is where you live or about your family, and these are not people that you know personally, or they're asking you for bank account information, or they're stating that somebody has stolen your identity and they need you to provide very specific personal information in order to get things taken care of. I know that I had a friend who, she was told that her computer had a virus, and if they gave them access to her computer, that they could take the virus out of her computer, and it was a scam. So they definitely do target people who may be unaware, and may get scared and want to do whatever it is that the person is telling them to do to have the issue taken care of. But anytime somebody is asking you for that personal information, my rule of thumb is always don't give it. That's the first rule of thumb. And then if, for instance, they're stating that, let's say your grandson, something has gone wrong and they need this money wired, which is a big one. Getting off of the phone or off of the chat in the computer, wherever they're targeting you through, getting off of there and verifying the information through known sources, like contact a family member to check on your loved one that they're saying is in trouble. If they say your bank account has been tapped into, contacting your bank directly at numbers that you have for your bank, to ensure that if something needs to be taken care of, it can be, but otherwise you realize that it's a scam. So verifying information through known sources and not utilizing any links or any numbers that the person on the other end is giving you, I think is the best way to handle those situations.
Yeah, that was a brilliant piece of advice. That's something that we need to look out for, because this is on the increase, especially with the COVID recession. People are trying to make money through all these scams and emails and phone calls, what have you.
Yes.
Tara, you also talked about one form of trafficking where the motive is to take the organs out of someone's body without consent, and sometimes with consent. In fact, there are some parts of the world, for example, in the Indian subcontinent, where out of poverty, unemployment, and the economic situation, people are sometimes forced to sell a kidney, for example, just so that they can pay off their debts or put food on the table. And there are groups that are quite active and they're operating in these specific regions, targeting communities, sometimes entire towns, where they go and they offer a specific amount of money that they will be receiving in exchange of an organ. And this is something which is also on the rise, unfortunately. And for some reasons, it doesn't always get reported. And some governments don't even take much action. Law enforcement agencies are kind of quite oblivious, of the situation and the ongoing exploitation. What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts on that are that we definitely need to be taking action. And again, that is where, as social services, if we're able to help people who are in need, they'll be less vulnerable for this type of trafficking as well, right? So I know that in the UN report that I had referenced before, there were multiple countries who did report the organ trafficking occurring. And those were reported in North Africa, in South and Southeast Asia, Central America, and Europe. Out of the 148 countries, that's where those were located. And all of the forms of trafficking, I really feel that the best method of prevention, other than awareness that we've talked about, is meeting needs, like helping to meet needs and caring for the people who are in need, because people do what it's survival. They do what they feel like they have to do in order to meet their basic needs. So it's really difficult to prevent trafficking when there are many needs that need to be met. So without it, doing this hand in hand with both meeting the needs and also ensuring that we have laws in place and prosecution occurring for those who are the traffickers and those who are the buyers, because let's face it, like if there were not buyers, there wouldn't be a business for exploitation.
Yeah.
So if we are addressing all of those things, that is how we will have the biggest impact on trafficking and what it's doing to the victims, because these victims, not only are they going through the experiences of the trafficking experiences, whatever those experiences may be, but the trauma that they endure and how that affects their future, even once out of the situations, if they are fortunate enough to make it out of the situations, that trauma doesn't just disappear because they're away from the scenario. So it's important that we're taking every measure with all, it's kind of like the holistic approach to healing. Taking a holistic approach to coming against trafficking is the only way that we'll be able to reduce it.
You gave some fantastic examples of what we can do as individuals within a community or society. But I think at organizational level, a lot of charity organizations that are carrying out humanitarian aid work across the globe, they should also include targeting communities where out of poverty or economic situations, people are kind of prone to this kind of trafficking, just so that they introduce sustainable projects that would prevent this from happening at the grassroots level.
Yes.
And that's something that has to be done, in coordination with people who are carrying out research on the subject, law enforcement agencies, governments, charity organizations, and individuals like you. And I think everybody needs to come together. Like I said, we need to have a holistic approach for this as well.
Yes. I agree completely. And I know where I'm located, we have coalitions, so local coalitions, and I'm sure that they have them not everywhere, but many places. But in the coalition that I'm involved in, for instance, there are governmental agencies represented, there are NGOs represented, there are attorneys that come, there are like political people in politics who are part of the the groups. We've had doctors, we've had just individuals who have decided to come, and we've also had law enforcement. So it is really trying to have that holistic approach towards the local area, to where not only are there several people from several different backgrounds, but for instance, with the nonprofits that are serving survivors, they're looking at gaps. Like, where are our services? Where are there gaps in our services, and what is needed so that we can make sure we're having the biggest impact as possible? So I agree completely that we need to be looking at this thing holistically and taking care of things in that manner, and without having people from different backgrounds coming to the table to have these discussions, it's nearly impossible to do.
And like you said, people who may have spare time and they really want to do something about this, they can offer their services through volunteering by becoming a part of that system that is working against, this trafficking of different sorts. And if somebody has an expertise, whether they are from a legal background or humanitarian background, they can all come together and offer whatever they can to make this a possibility.
Absolutely.
We talked about different forms of trafficking, and this is quite relatable. There's another thing which is quite common, and we see this, and I'm sure you've come across this too. A lot of companies, sometimes, beauty products or pharmaceutical companies, they often make their profit by using people who are financially in a difficult position, and they're so desperate that they will settle for anything. So they get peanuts for the work that they do, and then these big companies, they earn billions. So
Yes.
we often see products that says fair trade, or certain things that are used for producing cosmetics or toiletries or what have you. And when you really do your research, you find out that it's a kind of slavery that's ongoing. These people are not getting the wages they deserve for the time and effort that they put. And sometimes they are trafficked in the sense that they are taken from their hometowns or villages, and they are put in almost like a concentration camp where they are made to work round the clock.
Yes. Yes, that is something that is definitely occurring across the globe. And so many people think that forced labor means that they don't get paid anything. And it's important to note that forced labor could look like really long hours. It could look like not getting paid what they should get paid for that type of work. It could look like they were promised with this job that they would be doing certain duties, but the duties don't look anything like that they're actually having to do. And it could look like unsafe work environment, where they're not given the protective gear or equipment that they need in order to do the work, in a safe manner. So forced labor can look so different than what people have in their minds when they hear forced labor. But so often it is like such long hours and no breaks. And it doesn't matter whether they are healthy or sick or safe, like this work has to be done. And so they have to do it in order to either take care of their family or pay off a debt that the trafficker tries to make them feel like they have. Or there's been people who have done this type of work, and it was because there were family members being threatened if they didn't do this type of work. Or they could be living in the same place that they're working and not even able to have like a normal living situation and be comfortable in their living situation, but they're having to stay there and work and sleep and eat very little and no breaks. And so it's a horrific crime.
And what kind of work is happening around that at government level? And
A lot of governments are trying to create and or enforce labor laws to ensure that people are being fairly paid and fairly treated. But there's so much work to be done in that. I feel like it is so underreported, and so many people are afraid to report. Maybe it's a situation where they don't have the documentation that they need for the country that they're in. And so they're afraid to report something because they don't know what's going to happen to them if in fact they report that they're being treated wrong. But it happens to those locally in the society as well. They don't have to be from another country or any situation like that, because I know that that's something that people think of right away too. If they're not in their home country, then they're more easily exploited. And while that may be true, there's also people within their own countries being exploited through forced labor.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It's not something that's often talked about, not something that media, wants to showcase, because sometimes there are big companies involved and they don't want to kind of display their dirty laundry out there because they know the impact it will have on their customers. So I think as customers, we need to educate ourselves, and instead of just blindly buying products, I think we should make an effort to kind of look whether this is a fair trade company, for example, or they're not exploiting communities just to produce this product and sell it in the developed countries market. And that's, I think, one way of helping these businesses.
I agree. And I've heard recently a lot of talk that I agree with as well about ensuring that you're buying sustainable products. So even when it comes to clothing, not buying more clothing than what you need, because then, we get rid of our clothing that we don't need. And if we have more than what we need, oftentimes there's more people working behind that, correct? So there's more opportunity for that type of forced labor to be occurring. So making sure we buy sustainable products and products that we need, and checking down that supply chain. So making sure that everything that's needed to create a product is also being done fairly.
And I think the approach to this is, like you said, we're looking at a whole, looking at the whole bigger picture. And it's not just about ensuring that some people's rights are not being violated, but also the fact that this whole discussion around climate change and global warming and, things to be eco-friendly so they don't destroy the planet furthermore. This will also have an impact on that, not just the lives of people individually.
Correct. I agree. Anything that we can do that's reducing our consumption of products, I think is a good thing. That will help resolve many, or maybe not resolve, but reduce many of the issues that we face.
Tara, what advice would you give to people who, say, for example, experienced trafficking of some sort? And I'm not referring to trafficking at like a group level, but sometimes even someone you trust, someone, say, for example, in many parts of the world, people kind of from developed countries go to underdeveloped countries just to get married, knowing that we can bring someone over, force them to do work, not having the responsibility, obligation to pay them a salary, just because now we're related, exploiting them in that kind of way. And it's quite common in, say, for example, Western parts of the world, where people go back home, they get married, bring someone over, and that person is stuck in that cycle.
And when they're in that cycle, what's so hard for them is to find somebody that they can trust in an effort to end the cycle. So I would encourage those that are still in the situation to be careful. Safety your safety has to be first, as far as like trying to develop a plan to possibly leave the situation. And every situation is unique. So trying to tell somebody exactly how they should handle a situation is impossible, because of every situation being so unique and there being so many different players involved and different scenarios. So making sure that everything that you do, your number one reference is your safety. And if you can find somebody that is trustworthy, that can help you as far as developing a plan, a safe plan of escaping that situation, that is always very helpful. But once you have left the situation, it's important that you report if you are comfortable with that.
Yeah.
I think that it's really important that we don't push people to do the things that we think are the right thing to do, when it comes to if they've been a victim and how to handle a situation. So if you feel comfortable reporting, that's always recommended, so that we can ensure that the perpetrators and the people who are doing these horrific crimes are held accountable. But also making sure that you set your life up in a way that you want it to be lived. So you are able to be in a situation then to where you can heal, and you have the tools that you need in order to really thrive. And that takes time. Giving yourself grace through the healing process, I think, is one of the most important things, because you may feel like you're doing a wonderful job in your healing process and you're coming so far. And then one day you feel like you've taken 2 steps back. And I think that it's really important that you give yourself grace during that period, because healing is not linear.
Yeah.
It's not a straight line. It ebbs and flows. And so making sure that you are in a situation then to where you can give yourself that grace, I think, is important.
That was a beautiful advice that you've given. Tara, any last final message that you would like to give to our viewers before we wrap up?
I think that the biggest message is knowing that you can make a difference. So often we think, if it's a global problem, I'm just little me. Like, what am I going to do to have an impact on something so enormous? But if we all play our part, then we can have an impact on something that's affecting so many different lives.
Definitely. And it will also create like a ripple effect where things will kind of slowly, gradually get, bigger and better. Thank you so much for taking the time out, talking about such difficult and sensitive topics, sharing your experience. And I just want to ask you before we leave, if anybody wants to contact you, Tara, if they want to share an experience or just seek your advice or consultation, what is the best way forward?
They can definitely reach out to me. I can be reached by email. That would probably be the best method. And my email address is yetstillistand@gmail.com.
Love that email address. Thank you so much for today, Tara. And I wish you all the best. And I really personally appreciate the work that you're doing and making a difference in the lives of people, despite everything that you've been through. And like you said, healing is a journey. It's not a straight line, and it works differently for different people. But the main thing is not to give up on yourself, not to be hard on yourself, and just take one day at a time.
Thank you.
Thank you. To all our viewers, thank you for joining us. And we'll see you again next Saturday with another guest, another topic. And till then, look after your mental health. Assalamu alaikum.